The courtroom buzzed with the usual murmurs of anticipation, a steady hum of voices blending into the creaking of wooden benches and the occasional shuffle of heavy boots on the polished floor. It was one of those cases that had drawn an audience, a mix of reporters, curious bystanders, and a handful of individuals who had long stopped believing in justice. Officer Darren Cole leaned back against the defendant's table, his fingers idly tapping against the smooth surface, his other hand rolling a cigarette between his thumb and forefinger. He smirked, amused at the ridiculousness of it all. It wasn't the first time he had been accused of excessive force, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The system had his back, always had, always would. The world didn't work any other way for a man like him. Across the room, a woman sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She was composed, her dark skin glowing under the fluorescent lights, her expression unreadable. There was something about her presence calm, yet commanding, that made a few people take notice, though no one quite placed why. She didn't seem like a lawyer, nor a typical observer. But she waited, unmoving, her eyes steady and unwavering. Darren barely spared her a glance. His attention was on the judge's seat, still empty. He exhaled, shaking his head. Bureaucracy. Nonsense, just another wasted day. He pulled his cigarette from his pocket, placing it between his lips, lighting it right here, right now. In the courtroom wasn't exactly allowed, but who was going to stop him? He had done worse. Hell, he had done far worse, and no one had ever had the guts to put him in his place. The chatter dulled as the bailiff stood, his voice cutting through the air. All rise for the honourable judge. The name was spoken, clear and firm. And then the room went silent. The woman in the chair stood up, graceful, unhurried, unshaken. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. A few in the room exchanged glances, some realizing only now what was happening. Darren, however, remained unfazed, his cigarette burning at the edge of his lips. She approached the bench, her hands adjusting the robe that had been draped over her chair. And then she turned slowly, deliberate, facing him directly for the first time. Their eyes met. Darren froze. A cold realization slithered up his spine. The cigarette slipped slightly from his lips, barely hanging on. His fingers twitched. The woman before him, the one he had barely acknowledged, the one he had dismissed as just another nobody in the room, was the judge. And she knew exactly who he was. The silence in the room thickened, pressing in on Darren like an invisible weight. His mind raced, flashing back to every encounter, every reckless action, every moment where he had believed himself untouchable. The smirk that had once curled his lips was gone, replaced by something else, a fleeting trace of unease. Judge Celeste Monroe let the moment linger, her gaze unwavering. Then, with the slightest tilt of her head, she spoke, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Officer Cole, I assume you are prepared to stand trial today." Darren swallowed, the dryness in his throat unexpected. "Of course, Your Honor," he muttered, regaining his composure. He had been in tight situations before. He could talk his way out of this. He always had. But Celeste knew better. She had spent years studying men like him, the ones who thought power gave them immunity. And this time, the law was in her hands. She leaned forward slightly, placing her hands on the bench, her fingers pressing against the wood as if anchoring herself to the moment. "Then let's proceed," she said, her voice carrying through the room. The case unfolded, each testimony peeling back another layer of Darren's past. Witnesses spoke of intimidation, of force used unnecessarily, of moments where his badge had been a weapon rather than a shield. Each word chipped away at the facade he had built over the years, exposing the cracks beneath. He could see it now, the shift in the crowd, the murmurs of disbelief turning into murmurs of recognition. Celeste watched him closely, knowing that this wasn't just about this case. This was about justice catching up, about accountability knocking at the door of a man who had spent his life outrunning it. And Darren, for the first time, wasn't sure if he could outrun it anymore. The tension built, a slow but inevitable climb, towards something neither of them could yet name. Darren clenched his jaw, his mind spinning for a way out. But Celeste wasn't done. Not yet. She leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Then, In a voice just loud enough to cut through the air, she said, "Officer Cole, do you recall an incident at the cop per bar 2 years ago?" Darren's grip tightened on the table. He did, and if she was bringing it up now, that meant only one thing. She knew exactly what had happened that night. The lies, the cover-up, the people who had been too afraid to speak. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes, and Celeste saw it. A hush settled over the courtroom as the prosecutor methodically laid out the details. The cop per bar incident had been buried under layers of deception, but now, one witness after another began to step forward. A bartender who had been there that night, a young man who had barely escaped Darren's wrath, a fellow officer who had stayed silent for too long, but had finally found the courage to speak. Darren's face, drained of colour, as the truth unravelled before him. Each testimony was a nail in the coffin of the life he had carefully constructed. His hands trembled as he realised that the power he had once wielded so recklessly was slipping away. Celeste remained unwavering. She let the evidence speak for itself. And when the final words were spoken, when the jury had no choice but to see Darren Cole for who he truly was, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty. Darren barely heard the words. His mind swam with the weight of his downfall. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. Celeste exhaled, a slow, measured breath. Justice had been served, not just for this case, but for all those who had suffered in silence. As Darren was led away, the courtroom began to stir, voices rising in quiet, astonished relief. She gathered her papers, her expression unreadable as always, but as she rose from her seat, her gaze lingered on the empty space where Darren had stood. Then, with a quiet dignity, she turned and walked away, leaving behind a courtroom that would remember this day for a long time to come.